This podcast is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the business psychos and does not reflect the viewpoints of their current or former employers or clients. Thank you.
It's the business psychos, and today we're gonna talk it out. The podcast about what execs shouldn't talk about. Connecting executives and those who aspire. We're here to have a conversation, yeah, we're gonna light the fire. It's the business psychos. Yeah. The business psychos.
Welcome to Business Psychos, where we discuss how to navigate the complexity of corporate culture and modern life without becoming a psycho. I'm Mary. This is Katie, and we are the Business Psychos. Hey, Katie, what's up? How was your weekend?
Hey, my weekend was fantastic. The weather was perfect. I've had the new Dua Lipa album, Radical Optimism, on repeat for summer vibes. Such a great up-tempo kind of feeling. And last year, this time, I had the Janelle Monáe Age of Pleasure on repeat. So if you haven't gotten into that album, run, don't walk.
I love Dua Lipa. And I totally agree. She has like the summer vibes, which are so important because like you remember certain years of your life by like the song of the summer. Weather was good here in the Hamptons. I was outside doing my gardening, but otherwise outside swimming, biking. I received a kayak as a gift last year, which I need to figure out how to use. It's a fold-up kayak. It's like an origami kayak, which is a little disconcerting. I'm told it's seaworthy, so I'll be going on YouTube next week to figure out how to use it without the Coast Guard coming out to rescue me.
Well, so this kayak is the stuff of dreams for me, by the way. I have the Charles River behind my house, and a semi-portable kayak that could drop in would change my life. So
I'm going to send you a link. It's perfect if you don't want to put something on top of your car. So
if I walk out my back garage, I just go over a bridge and the Charles is there. So having a kayak that I can carry over, I really need you to test this out and tell me how it goes.
Shout out to Luke too. I heard it. He's kind of concerned about mom going out on the Charles River in an origami boat.
Yeah,
no. Excuse me. He's like,
yeah,
veto. So we're talking about shame today, which is one of the most powerful and destructive emotions. Shame torments the person who carries it. And people who have experienced toxic shame often struggle with a range of emotions. This might be low confidence and self-persecution, or even being judgmental, critical, or even bullying. These character traits have significant impacts in the workplace, and when ignored or normalized, can lead to toxic cultures.
And Mary, we should let our audience know that this episode and next week will be a two-part series. The working title is Shame, but it encompasses so much, navigating power dynamics, bullying. We're framing this all around the concept of experiencing shame, and we've shifted our production to accommodate 2 episodes.
Absolutely. We've gotten a lot of feedback that folks would like us to spend a little more time going deeper on some of the topics. So we'll be adding more 2-parters next season. When we come back, we're talking about shame here on Business Psychos. Shame is an important one to define because there are general misperceptions of what it means. It's often conflated with guilt. The definition from the American Psychological Association, the APA, defines shame as a highly unpleasant, self-conscious emotion arising from the sense of there being something dishonorable or immodest in one's conduct or circumstances. While guilt is also a self-conscious emotion, it's more about regret about something you've done. Shame, on the other hand, involves deep-seated negative feelings about oneself, about who you are at your core. Shame is a ubiquitous human experience. It is used in every culture to socialize children for survival. Our physiological reaction to shame helps us maintain the interpersonal bridges that are imperative for our survival as social creatures. Because this is hard-coded in our DNA, these types of feelings can be incredibly powerful. When we are shamed inappropriately, for example, by an abusive caregiver in childhood, we may short-circuit this internal mechanism and find ourselves suffering from toxic shame. Shame researcher Brené Brown describes shame as the intense, painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. So, feeling bad, unworthy, unlovable, and without value is bad. But what makes this so horrible is the feeling that this is going to result in you being pushed out of the tribe, which puts your survival at risk. Research shows that shame is highly correlated with substance abuse and addictions, depression, anxiety, PTSD, dissociation, aggression, self-harm, and even somatic complaints. Wow. Okay, so all this is interesting, but we're a business podcast, so let's talk about shame at work. Firstly, we can be shamed by ourselves, or we can be shamed by others. We're going to talk about both kinds today. It's also worth noting that shame can be obvious and overt, like in the case of the workplace bully, but it can also occur in more subtle, covert ways. This can be true in mid to large size companies where people act in predictable ways. I call it work theater. I love this. People say things like, let's circle back to this later. I don't want to boil the ocean here, right? Everybody knows what I'm talking about. You'd think that with employees participating in work theater, there'd be fewer instances of people being shameful to one another. Unfortunately, I've seen it just manifest itself in more passive-aggressive and subtle ways. This can be worse than dealing with an obvious bully. If someone is shaming you in a covert way, you can find yourself wondering if it's all in your mind or if you're overreacting. Also, this kind of behavior can be difficult to escalate to HR. Okay, Katie, I thought we'd try a little podcast theater here. If this doesn't work, we can edit it out. I want everybody to imagine you're on a call with your boss and their boss, who is someone who has the word chief in front of their title. There are a few other bigwigs from other departments on too. And your job is to present board slides that you and your team have worked on for review. You're nervous, and you can tell your boss, let's call her Belinda, is nervous too. You've been practicing by yourself all morning, opening the presentation and flipping through the slides. Now it's showtime. Your boss, Belinda, is making pleasant small talk with her boss and the bigwigs, then asks you to pull up the deck and present it on Zoom. You do this and flip to the first page, and she barks at you. Go back. We're not ready for this part yet. All right, so you go back to the title page and you let her finish her little spiel. Then she barks at you again. Next page. Hello, are you there? Flip to the next page. So now you're feeling nervous. Maybe your stomach is doing somersaults and you can feel a cold sweat on the back of your neck. You flip to the next page, which has a nice graph that you spent a lot of time on. You can feel your heart beating fast. This whole scene is very intense. Now the bigwigs, they seem really interested in your graph. The analysis is compelling and they all start to talk amongst themselves. So now you start to feel a little bit better now. Maybe even proud that your work is getting this kind of recognition. You're also relieved that the spotlight is off. But then a bigwig asks a question about the data, always the data. And your boss, Belinda, replies that it's from X source and as of last week. But the person challenges the data quality and gives an example of why. It says they think it's all wrong. Belinda turns to you and in front of everybody asks you to explain why this is. You stammer a bit and she goes, well, do you know or do you not know? And so you reply, you just aren't sure. And then Belinda replies, you told me you checked the data several times, so I'm not sure why you can't answer this question. You need to come to these calls with this button down in advance. Otherwise, you're wasting everyone's time. Belinda then turns to her boss and his peers and apologizes. She says she'll ensure that this is ironed out and circulate a response later in the day. Whew. So Katie, I'd be interested in your thoughts on subtle versus overt shame and your experience in the startup environment, where maybe there's less of this stodgy corporate theater that I've described here.
I'm going to answer your question, but first, as a response to the vignette you just presented, these types of experiences are so relatable for anyone who's worked in a professional environment. Just listening to a story like that be told, which on the surface, it's like a slide deck was presented to people. If you work in a professional environment, you know that subtext within that can be so incredibly loaded that it can, throw you into a tailspin for a good long while. So as far as talking about overt and subtle shaming in the startup versus large companies, I'll start by saying that what you're describing as work theater, I've observed and experienced these dynamics everywhere: classrooms, high school peer groups, homeowners association, legal negotiations with attorneys, and definitely in every professional environment I've worked in, from my first job at Wendy's Hamburgers for $3.75 an hour to executive level work that pays quite a bit more. I see it as power grappling, and it underpins every human interaction, though it is not commonly acknowledged on the conscious level, and it uses shame as cheap and dirty currency when it's easily available. I see power grappling as an outcropping of a deeper fundamental human need to feel control and power and establish oneself in the hierarchy for survival purposes. So it's more common for folks to acknowledge how an interaction makes them feel than examine the deeper mechanics. And this is where shame can enter the stage and become energetically destabilizing, hijacking the ability to think clearly. So, as you said, shame is powerful, and some people can clock it in a person and then weaponize it. And then they activate it like an explosive device inside that other person. So in high power professional cultures, there are many demonstrations of shamelessness to emphasize dominance, and use the term theater, which has some profound connections to something I wrote about in the Parinama method, specifically as it relates to how power dynamics exist just below the surface of all human interactions. The brilliant co-creator of improv theater, Keith Johnstone, found that theater scenes have a lack of realism, that they're uncanny when the actors do not apply the subtle behaviors and movements convey the power dynamic of the interaction. So he surfaced what these actions, behaviors, and movements are and taught them. They're mostly subconscious, but very effective. So if you want to learn a bit more about that, chapter 6 in the Parinama method. But now for your question about the difference in power dynamics in tech companies, if you work in growth tech companies, because you want to get away from corporate, it's not possible. If you want to generate real revenue, it's necessary to build and close commercial deals with massive commercial companies, government agencies, bureaucratic organizations like higher education, because they have money. But anecdotally, I'll note that some of the most abusive behavior comes from folks in larger companies. Some of these behaviors you can work around and preserve your dignity. Some you have to bite the bullet for a longer term vision for the organization. And then there are cases where you have to draw the line and make it clear that without changes to the dynamic, we're going to walk on a deal. But in the process of closing a deal, procurement and legal can beat you up for sport and belittle you because you have no recourse. They hold all the cards, and apparently some enjoy making you squirm. Or some folks use their power to keep you silent about their inadequacy and slow turnaround. They control the narrative, so it's a precarious balancing act to move things without pissing them off and slowing things down even more. Specific examples of this would be good material for, Business Psychos After Dark once everybody has signed NDAs. And that's a joke. I will never talk. Wink, wink. on the topic of shame and self-shaming, people who have caregivers, usually parents, but not always, who were harsh before it's developmentally possible to contextualize the harsh behavior with other perspectives. It's the only one presented, and it's larger than life and represents the environment we must navigate and adapt to. So our nervous system gets built around protections like preemptively judging ourselves or being preemptively critical of others, like block the punch before it reaches us. Internalizing shame begins as a defense that very quickly becomes maladaptive. So we often internalize that early judgmental and critical voice, unable to differentiate it from our own because its insertion happened when episodic memory and critical thinking cognition were still on our developmental roadmap. If unchecked, it all just becomes a part of our inner monologue as adults that feels true. And it's not. More on that later. There are exercises in chapter 6 of the Parinama method for working on this. In fact, Parinama offers a powerful reconciliation for internal shame. We can place the full blame on our parents, but the spell of this early programming would be lifted if we didn't exist in a social matrix that trades on power and uses shame as a cheap and easy access point for alleviating you of your power. So yes, our caregivers planted the seed, but if we do not take an active role in reclaiming ourselves, systems and individuals are waiting to capitalize on this vulnerability. Also, there are cases where a parent creates a bubble of unrelenting positivity with zero resilience and respect for shame. Then their child gets bombarded without defense when they begin to socialize, because shame is a function. But when over-indexed, uses cheap and easy control, it infiltrates everything. So you mentioned earlier how it's part of the development of a human being's psyche. So when properly sized and structured, it acts as a moral compass, naturally occurring accountability. So you cause harm, you feel terrible until you resolve it. However, if you feel awful about everything, the power of this naturally arising internal judicial system just gets washed out. And it's hard to take accountability because the intolerable experience of shame requires near constant defensiveness against the terrible feelings. Accountability works with a well-formed and properly sized relationship with shame. People who are extra hard on themselves and tend to take more than their share of responsibility for the actions of others to be in a defensive battle to protect their dignity. So it's either punish oneself with work or be punished with failure. Both options produce suffering, inadvertently fulfilling the mistaken belief of low self-worth. And so folks bound by shame tend to second guess what they say and to go out of their way to avoid embarrassment. And in extreme cases, people can be self-flagellating, almost self-abusive, really. In other cases, it might just be an internal critical voice that's always floating around the back of their head, being negative. Also, notably, this voice always plays down accomplishments and successes. So the internal feedback mechanism is always skewing against the individual.
Yeah, you called it out earlier when you just said, there are systems in place that are going to take full advantage of this. And I think this is also why it's important to remember that none of us really understand what another person might be going through. And for folks who are dealing with harsh inner critics, I hope you can find some relief through therapy. In my experience, this is something that is so deeply embedded that it's tough to change, especially without the right kind of professional support.
There's an important place where shame, internal shame, and the associated issues of self-worth show up in professional life. And that's when it matters most, at the career inflections where we negotiate for our value. So many high-performing people go off the rails when it comes to raises, promotions, and when negotiating job offers. Negotiation and conflict are very similar with the underpinnings that support our success or failure in them. And I learned how to effectively negotiate by having my staff negotiate with me. It started with someone who walked into my office and said, "Is there a good time to talk about a review?" And then when we did talk, he was very clear with his case and came with questions. What's possible for me? The expectation for the role was X, and I performed at X plus 1. I'd like a raise of X dollars based on what was presented as possible and a path to insert role here. What's fair right now? And what could I be doing to make a better case for myself? Like the first time this happened, I was gobsmacked. It doesn't need to be a fight for my dignity. Every negotiation I had after that initial interaction was deeply impacted and made dramatically more successful. High-level principles for succeeding in negotiation and conflict are reduce or eliminate shame about wanting what you want. Avoid emotional contamination. You want to be able to stay clear-headed and matter of fact. Yes, this is personal for you, but the reality is that it's a business problem to be solved. Third, I'd say understand what the other party values. And lastly, know your worth and be able to clearly articulate it. Don't overshoot too high and definitely don't undershoot. Employees who are burdened with critical and unforgiving inner voices will find it challenging to navigate the political and interpersonal side of work. The inner voice might drive them to be perfectionist and overachieve, shout out to our episode on the danger of being an overachiever. So their productivity and the quality of their work might be high, but the torment inside of them can negatively impact their ability to adapt to change, negotiate or collaborate with others. This can detract from all their otherwise great work, reflecting poorly on them. Shame will certainly impact their ability to take constructive feedback, which interferes with their ability to grow. So if I seem kind of impatient with terms like overachiever and perfectionist and people pleaser, it's because they're holding up a lie. They are these virtuous terms that subtly, position themselves as counter and superior to like lazy, sloppy, selfish behavior. The internal narrative often involves shaming people without these same, so-called standards. So if I'm hiring somebody who self-identifies as perfectionist, I clock them as anxious and consider it a red flag. If someone tells me they can't help it, they're a people pleaser, that's another flag. You probably don't stand up for yourself and self-abandon if there's the possibility of a conflict and become resentful. Overachiever, like what's the over? A compensation for? How about being an achiever? It's how people surrender themselves without realizing and mislabel the behaviors as virtuous, making it even harder to correctly identify. Also creating like a low-key critical energy around the not so subtle implication that these behaviors are superior. These beliefs block so many people from experiencing the true depth of their talent, while they create ripples of projection with their shame and low self-worth. I have deep, enduring empathy for the person and impatience for the lies of what shame is telling people and the internal contortions it creates. So I'm less patient with shame because I think that treating it with respect validates it. Mary, we frequently talk on the show about the challenge and complexity of playing the game. So if navigating this isn't hard enough, imagine working with the additional burden of being your own worst enemy.
You said it earlier, the first step is really recognizing that the voice isn't you. And the other thing, it isn't truthful. And knowing that alone, for some people, might be a game changer. It might also be helpful to evaluate how some of your work stressors are related to this voice. Maybe write down a little inventory of all the things at your job that are upsetting you today, and then ask yourself if you're being unnecessarily difficult on yourself, or are you setting yourself up with unrealistic expectations? The other thing I would add is that if you are someone with this cruel inner critic, you need to be extra careful in choosing people and environments for yourself. If you are accustomed to being treated harshly, a part of you, even unconsciously, might find this familiar. A quote I've shared on the show before is sometimes unhealthy familiar is more appealing than healthy unfamiliar. So take stock of the messages you tell yourself and whether you're allowing others to possibly speak to you in this way. And this leads us to the next example, which is people who shame others. So some people who grew up with harsh, judgmental, and potentially emotionally limited caregivers can internalize the behavior and express it outwardly to others. Sadly, they grow up to be adults like the ones who hurt them. These people might set unrealistic standards, have little to no patience or empathy with others' imperfections, and might even push people away or sever relationships entirely. This is done to avoid their own vulnerabilities and unresolved, unacknowledged pain. This is the common one, the easy one to see in the workplace. I imagine most of our listeners know someone like this. Because of organizational dynamics, these folks might choose politically weaker people to pick on, but not always. I've seen plenty of examples firsthand of a person attacked and belittled by someone of the same rank. I've even seen some interesting cases where an employee punches up and shames someone more senior to them. For obvious reasons, this is likely to be done in far more passive-aggressive ways. So another vignette or example, I was once on a call with a peer whose direct report, an analyst, acted this way. It was the three of us on the call. And my peer had asked his employee to rerun analysis. The employee responded that he had already looked at the most recent data and that there are no notable differences month over month. And I remember it was a video call because I can see in my mind's eye that there was like this eye rolling and facial grimacing and demonstrable angst, something like, okay then, I don't see the logic in that other than having us do a whole lot of work just for the optics, but okay, you're the boss, ouch. The point is shaming can occur subtly, even between a subordinate and their boss. That said, in my experience, it's much more common to see shame exchanges from a senior person to a more junior employee. This is done in line with the business hierarchy. So these nightmare bosses have insecurities anchored in low self-esteem. They counter this by feeling better about themselves, by shaming people they perceive as weak or inferior. Also, and this is an important one, they often tend to pick on the people whom they find the most threatening. This can be devastating for the hardworking employee who is trying hard to please and impress the boss. Instead of getting that desperately sought-after positive validation, they find themselves being their boss's least favorite. I have mentored people who are dumbfounded by this. It's so counterintuitive. They'll say, but Mary, I did X, Y, and Z. The work I'm doing, it's well beyond that of anyone else. But my boss still rides me and treats me like crap. I don't get it. So I should stop and just call out that a manager calling out a performance issue isn't bullying. And yes, sometimes as human beings, managers might lose patience with a direct report and act in a way which embarrasses and shames them. To be clear, this isn't good, and there are opportunities for all of us to learn how to expand our capacity for frustration. That said, and you mentioned this at the top, Katie, about power, right? Being a bully is something different. That's what we're talking about here. This is about the power dynamic. And it's also about the capacity for reconciliation. Katie, we spoke on our past show, I think it was Outgrowing People and Places, about this concept of rupture and repair. We are all human and we're all going to make mistakes. We're going to hurt and disappoint one another. It's impossible to be perfect unless you're being fake or phony, and that's a different problem and a different show. The important part of interpersonal dynamics is about one's ability for self-reflection, reconciliation, and repair with the other. Every time this process happens between two people, there's an opportunity for learning and growth. And Katie, as you and I shared with our listeners in that show, it makes the relationship deeper and more genuine.
Yeah.
But bullies, unlikable as they are suffering with unresolved, unacknowledged shame. They have a diminished capacity for self-reflection and any sincere participation in this rupture repair process. To your point earlier, Katie, this becomes a vicious cycle because it blocks their ability to adapt their behavior, grow, and mature relationships, whether they're personal or professional.
I guess like as our final section today, talking about toxic work environments and how unresolved shame contributes to them. Power dynamics in human interactions can't be avoided, but when they're fracked using shame, they have a really nasty and unfortunate quality. And in your earlier example, the boss belittled and humiliated their direct report on a call with other people, like including their own boss. And this is a great example, or it's not a great example, but it's a great example of a culture that has a problem. In that example, Belinda did not hide her behavior at all. In fact, she basically used her employee as a human shield for her own shame. And the fact that she did this in front of her own boss tells me that the behavior is normalized there, if not encouraged and seen as a demonstration of power and dominance. If you have comments or stories about how shame has affected you at work, drop us a note in the comments. I can't wait to hear what our listeners think. Bye.
Hey, psychos, this is a two-parter. So circle back next week for the second part of Shame at Work. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with other psychos you know. We'd also love to hear from you, so hit us up on our socials. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook under @BusinessPsychosPod. Bye.
Forget about money. The currency of power is time. You know, the flex of being so busy and, and also being late or disrespecting the value of someone else's time in favor of the importance of your own.